June 1944. Western Front. 18,000 feet above northern France. The sky looked almost untouched by war. Thin clouds drifted slowly, stretched across a pale blue horizon that felt distant from everything happening below. Up here, there was no sound of artillery, no movement of tanks, no visible front line. Just open air, quiet, controlled, predictable. Inside the cockpit of a German fighter, an experienced ace scanned the distance with practiced calm. His movements were precise, almost effortless. He wasn't searching with urgency. He was observing, waiting. This was familiar territory. He had flown through skies like this dozens of times, maybe more. Each mission different, but the patterns always the same. And right now, nothing felt out of place. Then something appeared. At first, it was just a faint shape against the horizon. Small, indistinct, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. But instinct sharpened his focus. His eyes narrowed slightly as he adjusted his position, bringing the formation into clearer view. Other pilots in his squadron noticed it too. There was no panic, no sudden radio chatter, just quiet recognition spreading through the group. Aircraft, Allied. As the distance closed, the shapes became clearer. Broad wings, heavy fuselage, a silhouette that was instantly recognizable to anyone who had spent enough time in combat. The P-47 Thunderbolt. The reaction was almost underwhelming. The ace didn't tense. He didn't prepare for anything unexpected. If anything, his posture relaxed slightly. Around him, the formation held steady. No urgency entered their movements. No one rushed to change position. They had seen these aircraft before. Big, durable, but predictable. Slow to turn. Easy to outmaneuver in a proper engagement. This was not a threat. This was routine. He adjusted his heading slightly, already thinking ahead. The intercept would be simple. Dive in, force them into a turning fight, use speed and positioning to break their formation. Once they started reacting, once they lost structure, the outcome would follow naturally. It always did. Below them, the landscape stretched endlessly, quiet and distant. Supply lines moved across it. Roads, railways, depots, all of it part of a larger system that depended on control of the air above. And at this moment, that control still felt secure. The Thunderbolts continued forward, steady and unchanged. No evasive movement, no defensive reaction. Just a straight path, exactly what the German pilots expected to see. It reinforced everything they already believed. For a few more seconds, nothing changed. Then, without warning, the pattern broke. One aircraft shifted, then another. The formation loosened, not in confusion, but with purpose. The ace noticed it instantly. A slight hesitation entered his thoughts. Something about this wasn't right. This wasn't how they were supposed to respond. Before he could fully process it, the entire formation moved. Almost as one, the Thunderbolts rolled. Nose down. Not a gradual descent. Not a defensive maneuver. This was sharp, aggressive, deliberate. Their silhouettes tilted sharply toward the ground. And in that single motion, the calm sky transformed into motion and speed. The ace reacted instinctively, pushing forward, trying to follow. But immediately, something felt off. The acceleration was too fast. The distance changed in ways he didn't expect. The aircraft he had just dismissed were no longer moving like targets. They were falling with purpose. Engines roared as the Thunderbolts plunged into their dive. Gravity pulled them harder, faster, turning their weight into raw speed. The angle steepened. The air itself seemed to tear around them as they dropped toward the earth with terrifying precision. This wasn't hesitation. This wasn't defense. This was an attack. And suddenly, everything the German pilots thought they understood began to collapse. The engagement they had already imagined, already planned, no longer existed. In its place was something unfamiliar, something unpredictable, something they were not prepared for. The ace tightened his grip on the controls, his calm focus sharpening into something else. Not panic, not yet, but awareness. The kind that comes when a situation shifts just enough to break certainty. Above them, control was slipping. Below them, the ground was rushing closer for the diving aircraft. And in that moment, the realization began to form. What they thought was a slow escort fighter was about to become something else entirely. By the summer of 1944, the war over Western Europe had entered a phase where control of the sky meant far more than winning individual battles. It meant controlling the pace of the entire war. Every aircraft in the air was tied to something larger on the ground. Every interception carried consequences that extended far beyond a single engagement. And for the German pilots flying that day, this reality existed in the background of everything they did, even if they didn't always speak it aloud. For years, they had operated with a sense of confidence that had been earned, not assumed. Many of them were not just skilled pilots. They were aces, veterans who had survived multiple fronts and accumulated long records of victories. They had faced overwhelming odds before and found ways to win. Their reactions were faster, their instincts sharper, their understanding of aerial combat deeper than most of the enemies they encountered. Experience had shaped the way they saw the sky. It had taught them what to fear and what to dismiss. And over time, that experience had created something dangerous. Certainty. Because when you survive long enough, when you succeed often enough, patterns begin to feel permanent. The sky starts to feel predictable. You begin to believe that whatever appears on the horizon, you already understand it. Even as the war shifted around them, that belief remained. But below them, the situation was changing in ways that experience alone could not fully account for. Allied forces had moved beyond limited, cautious operations. Their strategy had become relentless. Bombing missions were no longer occasional disruptions. They were constant, organized, repeated with precision that made recovery difficult and, over time, almost impossible. Formations crossed into occupied territory day after day, striking not just targets, but the systems that supported the entire war effort. Fuel depots were among the most critical. Without fuel, aircraft could not fly, tanks could not move, and supply vehicles could not operate. These depots, once protected and reliable, were now being targeted with increasing accuracy. When one was destroyed, the effect wasn't isolated. It spread. Aircraft remained grounded. Movements were delayed. Plans had to be changed, sometimes abandoned entirely. Rail lines were another vital link. They carried everything: ammunition, equipment, reinforcements, food. They connected distant positions into a functioning network. But under constant bombing, those lines were being cut faster than engineers could repair them. Junctions that once ensured smooth coordination became points of failure. Delays turned into shortages. Shortages turned into vulnerability. And then there were the armored divisions. These units depended on both fuel and supply to maintain their effectiveness. Without consistent support, even the most powerful formation could be reduced to immobility. A tank without fuel is not a weapon. It is a burden. And as Allied bombing continued, more and more of these units found themselves waiting instead of advancing. The impact was not immediate collapse. It was gradual weakening. And that kind of damage is harder to stop. This is why the pilots in the air carried so much responsibility. Every Allied formation approaching from the horizon represented a decision point. If intercepted early and disrupted, the damage could be minimized. Bombers forced to scatter would lose accuracy. Targets might survive. Systems might continue functioning just long enough to hold the line. But if those bombers reached their objective untouched, the consequences would unfold quickly. A fuel depot could disappear in minutes. A rail junction could be rendered useless in a single strike. Supplies could be delayed long enough to create gaps that could not be closed in time. And once those gaps appeared, they could be exploited. The pilots understood this, even if they didn't think about it in those exact terms. It was built into the way they approached every mission, into the urgency behind every intercept, into the quiet focus that settled in before contact. They were not just defending airspace. They were protecting everything that depended on it. And yet, despite all of this, despite the growing pressure from above and below, one thing had not changed: their belief in control. Because from their perspective, they had faced change before. New aircraft had appeared. New tactics had been introduced. And each time they had adapted. Each time they had found a weakness, exploited it, and restored balance. So when they looked out across the sky and saw the approaching American formation, there was no sudden shift in mindset. No sense of alarm. Only recognition. Only familiarity. Only the quiet assumption that this situation, like so many before it, would follow a pattern they already understood. And it was that assumption, carried calmly into the next moments of the engagement, that made what was about to happen so significant. From a distance, the differences seemed obvious. The silhouettes alone told a story, and for experienced German pilots, it was a story they believed they already understood. The Messerschmitt Bf 109 was lean, narrow, and built for precision. Climbed fast, turned tightly, and reacted instantly to control inputs. The Focke-Wulf Fw 190 carried more raw power, a heavier armament, and an aggressive roll rate that made it dangerous in fast, decisive engagements. Both aircraft had been shaped by years of combat, refined by pilots who demanded performance where it mattered most. Against them, the P-47 Thunderbolt looked completely different. It was larger, heavier, built around a massive radial engine that gave it a wide, almost bulky presence in the sky. Where German fighters looked like sharp tools, the Thunderbolt looked like something designed to endure rather than evade. Its weight alone made it seem slower, less responsive. In a turning fight, that weight translated into a clear disadvantage. More mass meant more energy lost in tight maneuvers, wider turns, slower recovery. On paper, the comparison felt simple. The Bf 109 could outclimb it. The Fw 190 could outmaneuver it. Both could dictate the fight if they engaged correctly. And in aerial combat, control is everything. This wasn't speculation. It was experience. German pilots had encountered the Thunderbolt before. They had forced it into turning engagements and watched it struggle to keep up. They had seen its limitations. And over time, those encounters formed a consistent belief. The Thunderbolt was strong, yes, durable, able to absorb punishment that would destroy lighter aircraft. But durability alone does not win a fight. Position does. Timing does. Speed used correctly does. And in those areas, the Thunderbolt appeared predictable, manageable, even easy. So the conclusion settled naturally. This aircraft was not a serious threat. But in combat, conclusions carry weight. They influence decisions before a situation fully unfolds. They guide reactions before a pilot consciously thinks. And sometimes they hide the most important detail. Because while German pilots focused on what the Thunderbolt could not do, they overlooked what it was designed to achieve. Its weight, which made it feel sluggish in a turn, gave it stability at high speed. Its large engine, protected and resilient, allowed it to survive damage that would cripple more delicate fighters. Its reinforced structure could handle forces that pushed other aircraft beyond their limits, could dive faster, hold that speed longer, and remain controllable when others began to lose stability. But this advantage wasn't obvious at first glance. At altitude, in level flight, the differences seemed small. The numbers still supported familiar expectations. Climb rate, turning radius, acceleration in controlled conditions. Everything pointed toward the same conclusion German pilots had trusted for years. The Thunderbolt could be handled. The engagement would follow a known pattern. They would intercept, force a turning fight, break formation, and gain the advantage. It was a sequence they had executed before, often successfully. There was no reason to expect anything different now. And that belief settled quietly into their approach as they prepared to engage. What they did not realize was that they were preparing for a fight defined by the wrong conditions. Because the Thunderbolt was not built to dominate in controlled, level engagements. It was built for moments when control disappeared, for moments when altitude turned into speed, for moments when gravity became part of the fight. That was where its true advantage lived, hidden until the exact second it was needed. And as the distance between the two formations continued to close, that hidden advantage remained just out of sight, waiting for the moment when assumption and reality would collide. The distance between the two formations was closing, not rapidly, but with a steady, inevitable pull that every pilot in the sky could feel. At 18,000 feet, the air was thin and cold, the kind of environment where small differences in speed and position carried enormous consequences. The German formation held slightly higher altitude, a subtle advantage that had shaped countless engagements before. From above, they could control the first move. They could choose when to dive, when to engage, and how to force the fight into their terms. Speed was already being calculated. Each pilot adjusted his throttle with careful precision, maintaining formation while preparing for the moment of commitment. Too fast, and they risked overshooting. Too slow, and they would lose the advantage of momentum. It was a balance learned through experience, refined over time until it became instinct. Below them, the American formation continued forward, steady and unchanged. The P-47 Thunderbolts held their spacing with discipline, their formation geometry tight enough to maintain structure, but loose enough to allow movement when needed. There was no sudden climb, no attempt to break away, no visible reaction to the German presence above them. That, more than anything, reinforced the expectation. This was going to be straightforward. The German pilots began to position themselves for the intercept. Slight adjustments in angle, small changes in spacing, each movement deliberate, each pilot aligning himself for the opening attack. From above, they would dive through the formation, use speed to break cohesion, and force individual engagements. Once the Thunderbolts were separated, the outcome would follow quickly. Dive, engage, eliminate, reset. It was a sequence they trusted. The formation geometry supported it. The altitude advantage supported it. The speed they were building would support it. Everything about the situation pointed toward a controlled, efficient engagement. And still, the Americans did not react. Seconds passed. The distance closed further. In the cockpit, the German ace tracked the lead elements of the Thunderbolt formation, measuring angles, predicting movement. He expected a response by now. A defensive turn. A climb. Something to indicate awareness of the threat above them. But the formation remained steady, almost indifferent. That lack of reaction created a quiet tension. Not enough to disrupt confidence, but enough to be noticed. Altitude, steady. Speed, increasing. Distance, closing. The moment of commitment was approaching. Another few seconds, and the German pilots would begin their dive. Once that happened, there would be no hesitation. The engagement would unfold quickly, shaped by speed and positioning. Every decision made in the next moments would carry weight. And still, the Thunderbolts held their course. No break, no climb, no visible preparation for defense. It felt wrong, but not wrong enough to stop what was already in motion. The German formation tightened slightly as they prepared to initiate the attack. Control inputs became firmer. Focus narrowed. The sky, which had felt open and distant just moments before, now felt compressed. Every aircraft moving toward a single point of contact. 3 seconds. 2, 1. The dive was about to begin. And yet, in those final moments before engagement, the Americans had still not reacted in the way experience said they should. They weren't positioning for a defensive fight. They weren't preparing to turn. They were waiting. And that difference, subtle but critical, was about to change everything. The moment of commitment came without hesitation. German pilots pushed their noses down and drove into the attack, engines surging as altitude transformed into speed. The dive felt familiar, controlled, precise. This was the phase where experience took over, where timing and positioning shaped everything that followed. From above, they descended toward the American formation with confidence, each pilot already anticipating the next step. They expected the fight to begin the way it always had. The Thunderbolts would react. They would break formation, pull into defensive turns, try to force a maneuvering engagement where survival depended on quick reactions. That was the pattern. That was the rhythm of air combat they understood. But as the distance closed, that pattern didn't appear. The P-47 formation held steady. No sudden movement. No defensive break. No tightening turn. They continued forward. At first, the German pilots assumed a delay. Perhaps the Americans hadn't seen them yet. Perhaps the reaction was coming just a second too late. The ace narrowed his focus, aligning his approach, preparing to fire as soon as the angle allowed it. His breathing slowed. His grip tightened. Everything reduced to a single point of control. Range closing. Speed building. Target steady. Another second passed. Still nothing. The Thunderbolts were not reacting. The ace adjusted slightly, expecting the break to come at the last possible moment. That was often how it happened. A sudden turn. A desperate attempt to evade just before the first shots were fired. But the angle remained unchanged. The geometry of the engagement felt wrong. The targets were too stable, too deliberate, as if they were not concerned about the incoming attack at all. And then the German fighters reached firing range. This was the moment. The point where expectation and action were supposed to meet. But the engagement they had prepared for simply did not exist. There was no defensive maneuver to follow. No turning fight to exploit. No moment where superior agility would take control of the situation. The Thunderbolts refused to give them that opportunity. Instead of turning, they maintained speed. Instead of reacting, they continued forward. The ace hesitated just for a fraction of a second. Not out of fear, but out of uncertainty. His instincts were searching for a pattern that wasn't there. The timing felt off. The spacing felt wrong. The entire engagement was shifting in a direction he hadn't anticipated. Behind him, other German pilots experienced the same hesitation. The attack had begun correctly, but it wasn't unfolding correctly. The Thunderbolts did not slow down. They did not sacrifice energy to defend themselves. They carried it forward, preserving speed instead of losing it in tight maneuvers. And that single decision changed everything. Because without a turning fight, the German advantage disappeared. The dive that should have transitioned into control instead became a chase. The ace pushed forward, trying to maintain pressure, trying to force the engagement back into something familiar. But every adjustment felt reactive instead of deliberate. The Thunderbolts were not responding to the attack. They were ignoring it. And in doing so, they were dictating the terms of the encounter. Confusion began to spread through the formation. Why weren't they turning? Why weren't they defending? The questions came quickly, but answers did not. The German pilots adjusted their positions, trying to regain the advantage they expected to have. But the geometry of the fight continued to shift. Angles widened. Distance changed unpredictably. The clean, controlled engagement they had prepared for was slipping away. The ace felt it clearly now. This was not hesitation from the Americans. This was intentional. They were refusing the fight. And by refusing it, they were breaking the entire structure of the engagement. For a brief moment, the German pilots found themselves in an unfamiliar position. Not controlling the fight, but reacting to it. And in that moment, something subtle but critical began to change. Confidence gave way to uncertainty. Certainty gave way to questions. Because the enemy they thought they understood was no longer behaving the way experience said it should. The pattern was broken. And once that pattern disappeared, everything that depended on it began to unravel. For a fraction of a second, everything held in a strange kind of suspension. The German pilots were still adjusting, still trying to force the engagement into something familiar. The Thunderbolts were ahead of them, moving fast, refusing to turn. The geometry of the fight was already broken. And then, without warning, the Americans made their move. Almost as one, the P-47 Thunderbolts rolled. Not into a defensive turn. Not into a climb. But sharply, aggressively, nose down. The angle was immediate and steep. Far steeper than any normal evasive maneuver. Their wings tilted. Their noses dropped. And in that instant, the entire formation transformed from level flight into a vertical descent. It wasn't hesitation. It wasn't reaction. It was intention. The German ace felt it before he fully understood it. The sudden shift in motion. The way the aircraft ahead of him didn't just descend, but committed to the dive with absolute control. Then the acceleration began. First, it was manageable. A normal increase in speed as gravity pulled the aircraft downward. But within seconds, it became something else entirely. The Thunderbolts gained speed rapidly, far faster than expected. Their heavy frames, which had seemed like a disadvantage moments ago, now worked in their favor. They were getting faster. Too fast. The ace pushed forward, trying to follow, but the gap behaved strangely. Instead of closing cleanly, it stretched, shifted, distorted. The Americans were not just diving. They were building energy in a way that broke the rhythm of pursuit. The sound changed. The steady engine noise gave way to a rising, aggressive roar as air rushed past metal at increasing speed. The Thunderbolts cut through the sky with force, their descent turning into a controlled fall that bordered on violent. The air itself seemed to resist them, screaming around their wings as velocity climbed higher and higher. 300 miles per hour. 350. 400. The numbers built quickly, faster than the German pilots were prepared to match. Their own aircraft followed, but not with the same confidence. Not with the same stability. The dive angle was pushing limits. Control inputs became heavier. The margin for error narrowed with every second. Below them, the ground surged upward. Fields, roads, and structures grew larger, clearer, rushing toward the descending aircraft with alarming speed. The Thunderbolts did not adjust. They did not pull out early. They held the dive, maintaining their angle, maintaining their speed, as if they were aiming directly for the earth. And then, at the precise moment when instinct would demand recovery, they did something unexpected. They held it, a second longer, then another. The ace's instincts flared. This was too deep, too fast. Any delay in recovery could be fatal. But the Thunderbolts showed no hesitation. Their dive remained controlled, deliberate, perfectly timed. And then the purpose of it became clear. Bombs released, one after another. Dark shapes dropped cleanly from beneath the aircraft, separating instantly and falling faster toward the ground below. The Thunderbolts had not been preparing for a dogfight. They had been preparing for this. Dive bombing. The realization hit all at once. The entire maneuver, the refusal to turn, the preservation of speed, the steep dive, it all aligned into a single, undeniable truth. This had never been a fighter engagement. It was a strike. Explosions erupted seconds later. Sharp flashes of orange and black tore through the ground below, sending debris and smoke into the air. Targets that had seemed distant and protected were suddenly vulnerable, hit with precision and force. The Thunderbolts began to pull up, their speed carrying them forward and away from the impact zone. Even in recovery, they retained momentum, climbing just enough to escape while still holding the energy they had built in the dive. The German pilots, still descending, still reacting, found themselves out of position. They had expected a fight. Instead, they had flown straight into an attack they hadn't recognized until it was already happening. And in those few seconds, everything changed. The aircraft they had dismissed as slow and predictable had just demonstrated something entirely different. Not weakness, but power. Not vulnerability, but control. And the realization came too late to stop what had already begun. The first detonations didn't just strike the ground. They shattered the rhythm of everything happening above it. Fire and debris erupted upward in violent bursts, dark smoke punching through the air as the impact spread across the target area. What had been structured and controlled seconds earlier was now chaos unfolding in every direction at once. Fuel storage ignited. Secondary explosions followed. Shock waves rippled outward, distorting the air itself as fragments scattered across the landscape. From above, the German pilots saw it happen in real time. Targets they were supposed to protect were already burning. The timing hit hard. They were not intercepting an attack anymore. They were witnessing its success. The Thunderbolts, still carrying immense speed from their dive, pulled forward and began to climb away from the strike zone. Not sharply, not in a way that sacrificed energy, but with controlled momentum. They were not lingering, not turning back into the fight. They were moving through it, already transitioning into the next phase before the German fighters could fully respond. The ace pushed harder, trying to close the distance, trying to bring his aircraft into position for a shot. But the difference in speed was undeniable. The The Thunderbolts had built too much energy in the dive. They were pulling away, not slowly but decisively. He adjusted his angle, attempting to intercept from the side. Too late. Another pilot broke formation, diving after a single Thunderbolt, hoping to catch it before it could regain altitude. But the attempt collapsed almost immediately. The American aircraft didn't slow. It didn't hesitate. It carried its speed forward, widening the gap with every passing second. The German formation began to fracture. What had started as a coordinated attack was now a collection of individual reactions. Pilots broke left, broke right, each trying to recover control in a situation that was no longer structured. The clean geometry of engagement had disappeared, replaced by scattered movement and delayed decisions. Above them, below them, in front and behind, the sky was no longer organized. It was overloaded. Smoke from the explosions rose rapidly, creating visual interference. The ground, once distant and controlled, was now a shifting, burning reference point. Aircraft moved through it at different speeds, different angles, different intentions. There was no single direction to focus on, only fragments of action. The ace tried to recenter his awareness, scanning for targets, recalculating position, forcing his mind back into control. But every decision now felt reactive. Every movement came a fraction too late. The Thunderbolts were already resetting. They had entered fast, struck hard, and were now extending away before a proper interception could even form. Their dive had not just delivered damage. It had disrupted timing. It had broken coordination. It had turned a controlled engagement into a sequence of missed opportunities. Another explosion rolled across the ground, followed by a column of smoke rising higher than the rest. The scale of the strike became impossible to ignore. This wasn't a single hit. It was a coordinated attack delivered with precision. And the German pilots had been out of position for all of it. Attempts to regroup began almost instinctively. Pilots called out positions, adjusted headings, tried to reform into something usable. But the delay had already taken its toll. The Thunderbolts were no longer where they had been seconds ago. They had moved, climbed, spread out just enough to avoid being pinned down. The advantage had shifted. Not gradually, completely. The ace felt it in the way he now had to search for targets instead of tracking them. In the way he had to react instead of predict. The engagement was no longer his to control. It had been taken. And now, instead of executing a plan, he was trying to recover from its failure. Below, the fires continued to spread. Above, the formation that once moved as one had broken apart. And in the space between those two realities, something critical had been lost. Control. Not just of the fight, but of the situation itself. What had just happened in the sky did not look like an accident. It looked controlled, precise, almost calculated down to the second. And for the German pilots trying to recover from it, the question wasn't just what had happened, but how it had happened so effectively. The answer was not in a sudden change of tactics. It was in the aircraft itself. The P-47 Thunderbolt had always appeared heavy, almost oversized compared to the sleek lines of the Bf 109 or the EFFW 190. That weight had been seen as a disadvantage. In turning fights, it was more mass meant more energy lost in tight maneuvers, slower response, wider arcs. Everything about it suggested limitation. But in a dive, that same weight became something else entirely. Advantage. As the Thunderbolt rolled nose down, gravity did more than pull it forward. It accelerated it with increasing force, and the aircraft's mass allowed it to build speed faster and hold that speed longer than lighter fighters. Where other aircraft began to feel unstable at extreme velocity, the Thunderbolt remained solid, steady, controlled. It wasn't just falling. It was driving itself downward with purpose. And then there was its structure. The Thunderbolt was built to take punishment. Its airframe was reinforced, designed to withstand forces that would push other aircraft to their limits. In high-speed dives, those forces increased rapidly. Control surfaces became harder to manage. Wings flexed. Air pressure intensified. For many fighters, there was a point where pushing further simply wasn't safe. The Thunderbolt pushed past that point. It held together where others would begin to struggle. That difference mattered. Because in combat, the ability to go faster for longer without losing control is not just an advantage. It's dominance. The German pilots felt it the moment they tried to follow. As they entered the dive, their own aircraft responded differently. Speed increased, but not with the same stability. Control inputs became heavier. The margin for safe operation narrowed quickly. They could follow but not fully commit. Not without risking loss of control or structural failure. So they held back. And in that hesitation, the gap widened. The Thunderbolts were already beyond the speed where interception was easy. They had crossed into a zone where only an aircraft designed for that kind of stress could operate comfortably. And then there was the engine. The Thunderbolt's turbo-supercharged system allowed it to maintain power even as conditions changed rapidly. In a dive, as air density increased, that power translated into sustained performance. It didn't fade. It didn't drop off in the way some other engines did under extreme conditions. Kept delivering, which meant the Thunderbolt wasn't just fast. It stayed fast. That consistency allowed pilots to control their descent, time their release, and recover with enough energy to escape before interception could be organized. From the outside, it looked effortless. From the inside, it was the result of design meeting purpose. The German pilots had judged the aircraft based on what they valued most in a dogfight. Agility, climb, immediate response. And by those standards, the Thunderbolt seemed limited. But this was not a dogfight. This was something else. Here, speed was not a momentary advantage. It was the foundation of the entire engagement. And the Thunderbolt had been built around that foundation from the beginning. Its weight gave it acceleration in the dive. Its structure gave it stability at extreme speeds. Its engine gave it sustained power when others began to fall behind. Each piece worked together not to win a turning fight, but to control a different kind of battle entirely. And that was the realization beginning to take shape in the minds of the German pilots. They had not been facing a weaker aircraft. They had been facing a different one. One designed for a kind of combat they had not expected. One that did not need to turn to win, because it was never built to turn. It was built to survive speed. The realization did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, in small moments that didn't fit together the way they should have. A missed intercept, a widening gap that refused to close, a target that moved faster than expected, then disappeared before a shot could be taken. Each piece on its own could be explained, but together they formed something harder to ignore. This was not the engagement they had prepared for. The German ace felt it first as resistance, a quiet push against everything he had trusted up to this point. His instincts told him to press the attack, to recover position, to force the fight back into something familiar. But every attempt to do that only made the situation clearer. It wasn't working. The Thunderbolts were no longer where they were supposed to be. They weren't slowing down. They weren't turning. They weren't giving him anything to exploit. Instead, they moved with purpose, extending away from the strike zone, climbing just enough to maintain distance, keeping their energy intact. And with every passing second, the space between expectation and reality grew wider. He adjusted again, pushing his aircraft forward, trying to close the gap one last time. But the angle wasn't there. The speed difference remained. The opportunity he had expected simply never appeared. That was the moment the realization settled in. They had misjudged. Not slightly. Not in a minor way that could be corrected with a quick adjustment. But completely. The aircraft they had dismissed as predictable had just demonstrated a level of control and effectiveness they had not accounted for. Around him, the same realization was taking hold. Other German pilots began to break away, not in panic, but in recognition. The structure of the engagement had collapsed. Continuing the attack without advantage would only create risk without result. They had lost the position they needed to control the fight, and without that control, everything became uncertain. The formation loosened. Voices over the radio changed. Short, controlled instructions replaced confident calls. Positions were checked. Headings adjusted. The focus shifted from attack to recovery. This was no longer about winning the engagement. It was about disengaging from it. The ace pulled back slightly, easing his aircraft out of the aggressive pursuit. It wasn't a retreat driven by fear. It was a decision shaped by clarity. The conditions required to win were no longer present. Continuing forward would not restore them. Below, the fires continued to burn. Above, the Thunderbolts were already reorganizing, their movement calm, controlled, almost indifferent to the disruption they had caused. They had entered the engagement with a purpose, executed it, and left before the response could form. That kind of efficiency was difficult to ignore. The ace watched them for a moment longer, tracking their movement as they extended away. The instinct to chase was still there, but it had changed. It was no longer driven by confidence. It was tempered by understanding. These were not easy targets. They were not even predictable. They were something else entirely. The emotional shift was subtle but undeniable. Confidence, which had been steady at the beginning of the engagement, gave way to caution. Not hesitation, but awareness. A recognition that the situation required a different approach. That assumptions had to be questioned, not relied upon. And beneath that caution, something else began to form. Respect. Not admiration. Not yet. But acknowledgement. The kind that comes when an opponent reveals a capability you did not expect and cannot ignore. The Thunderbolt had forced that shift. Not through a prolonged fight. Not through overwhelming numbers. But through a single, precise demonstration of what it was capable of. The ace turned away, guiding his aircraft back toward the regrouping formation. The engagement was over, not because it had been fought to completion, but because it had been decided before it could fully unfold. And as he settled back into formation, one thought remained, clear and difficult to dismiss. The next time they saw the P-47, they would not make the same mistake. The sky began to settle long before the consequences did. Smoke continued to rise from the ground, thick and dark, marking the exact points where the attack had landed with precision. What had once been structured and operational now burned in scattered sections, each fire a reminder of how quickly control could be lost. From above, the damage was impossible to ignore. Storage areas were gone. Rail lines were broken. Movement on the ground had slowed, then stopped entirely in some sectors. For the German pilots circling back, the mission had already shifted from engagement to observation. They watched in silence as the results became clear. This was not a partial strike. It was effective. The Thunderbolts had entered fast, delivered their payload, and exited before a proper interception could form. There had been no prolonged fight, no drawn-out exchange of fire. And yet the impact on the ground was undeniable. The attack had achieved exactly what it set out to do. That realization carried weight, because it meant something fundamental had changed. Back at base, reports began to form around what had happened. Pilots described the same sequence, the same unexpected dive, the same inability to match speed, the same loss of control during the engagement. Each account reinforced the others, building a clearer picture of what the Thunderbolt was capable of when used this way. It was no longer just an escort fighter. It was a strike platform. And more importantly, it was effective. Damage assessments followed. Fuel losses calculated. Supply disruptions mapped. The effects would not disappear quickly. Repairs would take time. Resources would need to be redirected. And during that time, pressure from the Allies would continue. One successful strike created openings. Multiple strikes could widen them, and that possibility could not be ignored. For the German command, the response had to change. Interception strategies that relied on forcing turning engagements were no longer enough. Timing had to improve. Positioning had to adapt. Pilots needed to recognize the dive earlier, respond faster, and avoid being pulled into the same pattern again. Because what had happened once could happen again. And next time, the cost could be higher. Among the pilots, the shift was more personal. The confidence they carried into the engagement had not disappeared, but it had been reshaped. Experience had taught them to trust what they knew. Now, it was forcing them to adjust what they believed. The Thunderbolt was no longer something to dismiss. It was something to account for. something to respect. That change would influence every encounter that followed. Future engagements would begin differently. The sight of a P-47 formation would no longer feel routine. It would carry a question. What role are they playing this time? Fighter? Escort? Or strike? And that uncertainty alone would change decisions. Over time, tactics would evolve. Intercepts would be timed earlier. Approaches would be more cautious. Pilots would hesitate less to disengage when conditions were not favorable. The lesson had been learned, not through theory, but through experience. And experience, once earned, does not fade easily. The Thunderbolt itself had not changed. It had always been capable of this. But perception had. And in combat, perception shapes reality as much as capability does. The aircraft that had once been seen as heavy and predictable was now understood differently. The strength was not in turning, not in matching agility, but in controlling speed, in using altitude and weight to create momentum that could not easily be countered. That understanding would remain, long after the smoke cleared, long after the damage was repaired, long after the pilots who witnessed it moved on to other missions. Because moments like this do more than decide outcomes. They redefine them. They shift the way opponents think, react, and prepare. And sometimes that shift is more important than the damage itself. The sky returned to quiet. The formations disappeared into the distance. But the lesson stayed. They had seen the Thunderbolt before, but they had never seen it like this.